When the Grand Cherokee was introduced, its driver's side airbag represented the first use of this safety feature on a Jeep vehicle. For 1995, Cherokee becomes the next Jeep to feature an airbag. Welcome to MasterTech. In servicing the new Cherokee airbag, you may be tempted to rely on your experience with the Grand Cherokee system, but that would be a mistake. The Cherokee airbag is triggered mechanically and is different from the electrically triggered system on the Grand Cherokee. To see just how different the Cherokee system is, in the first part of this program, we'll look at components inside the Cherokee airbag module and see how they operate. Then we'll cover some precautions you'll need to take when servicing the airbag system and some airbag system service procedures. Finally, we'll look at some service procedures for a component you're not used to seeing on a Cherokee, a Clockspring. Unlike Grand Cherokee, the Cherokee Clockspring is not used for airbag deployment. However, it may need to be replaced after an airbag deploys. We'll also cover how to center a Clockspring that is out of position. Because the Cherokee airbag inflation is triggered mechanically, almost all of the components needed to deploy the airbag are contained in the driver airbag module. At the heart of the module is an impact sensor, which not only senses impact, but which also initiates deployment. To detect impact, the sensor uses a ball and cylinder. At the end of the cylinder is a D-shaft, which is held to the rear by a spring. If an impact is severe enough, it causes the ball to roll forward and push the D-shaft forward. This releases two spring-loaded firing pins, which make contact with primers. Now, if you've worked on the Grand Cherokee airbag system, you probably know that it can be disarmed by isolating the negative battery cable and waiting for the capacitors in the airbag system diagnostic module to discharge. Obviously, the same doesn't hold true for the Cherokee system. So, how is the system disarmed? The answer is a spring-loaded safety shaft found in the sensor. The shaft works with an arming screw in the steering wheel and arming lever in the airbag inflator. When the safety shaft is rotated by the combined action of the arming screw and arming lever, a slot in the shaft allows forward movement of the D-shaft. The airbag module is armed. When the arming screw is wound out, spring force rotates the safety shaft so that it blocks forward movement of the D-shaft. The module is disarmed. The rest of the airbag module is probably a lot like others you've seen. The primers we mentioned ignite the material in an enhancer. The enhancer, in turn, ignites sodium azide-based pellets, which generate nitrogen gas. A diffuser filters and cools the gas before it gets into the airbag. The rear panel of the bag has a porous weave and does not use vents. We talked a little about the role of the arming screw in the steering wheel. Besides arming the airbag module, the screw also moves a Nutblocker. The Nutblocker prevents you from removing two of the airbag module mounting nuts unless the screw has been wound out. In other words, you must disarm the module before you can remove it from the steering wheel. A cap over the access hole for the arming screw not only keeps dirt and other contaminants out of the module, when fully seated, it also indicates that the arming screw is all the way down and the airbag module is armed. Among the other changes made to Cherokee to accommodate the airbag are a corporate steering wheel and column and a lower instrument panel piece called a Kneeblocker. During a crash, the Kneeblocker and seat belt help keep a driver in position so the airbag can do its job. Now that we've looked at the airbag system components, let's run through what they would actually do in a crash. It's important to remember that, as with other systems, the Cherokee airbag system is designed to deploy only in frontal impacts. More specifically, the direction of the impact must be within a 60-degree cone formed by the front corners of the vehicle. Of course, as we pointed out earlier, in order for the system to be armed, the arming screw must position the safety lever so that the sensor's ball can move the D-shaft forward, releasing the firing pins. The firing pins make contact with primers. The primers ignite the material in an enhancer, which in turn ignites the gas generant. The nitrogen gas which results passes through the filter diffuser and begins to inflate the airbag, splitting the trim cover. The entire process just described takes place within 20 milliseconds of impact. The airbag is fully inflated at about 40 milliseconds and absorbs energy from the forward movement of the driver until about 110 milliseconds have elapsed. At this time, the driver begins to rebound from the airbag, which has begun to deflate. At about 170 milliseconds, the airbag is fully deflated. The deployment we've just described takes place only when a frontal impact of sufficient force occurs. The Cherokee airbag system is designed not to deploy as a result of ordinary off-road driving. Now, if you're used to diagnosing the Grand Cherokee airbag system, another difference in the Cherokee airbag may have occurred to you. Since no electrical circuits are used on the Cherokee system, it doesn't have the onboard diagnostics or the airbag system warning lamp found on the Grand Cherokee. Next, we're going to look at some of the precautions you'll need to take when servicing the Cherokee airbag system. Before we do, let's check your knowledge of system operation with a review question. To detect frontal impact, the Cherokee airbag system uses A. Impact sensors at the front corners of the vehicle, B. A safing sensor in the diagnostic module, or C. An impact sensor in the airbag module. The answer is C, an impact sensor in the airbag module. The sensor assembly causes two firing pins to contact primers, initiating the deployment sequence. As you might expect, the differences in the design of the Cherokee airbag lead to some differences in the precautions you need to take during service. After seeing the system's components, you probably already have a good idea of one of the most important precautions. Always disarm the airbag module by winding out the arming screw in the steering wheel. In addition to airbag module service, you must also disarm the module for steering wheel and steering column service and instrument panel service that involves lowering the steering column. When the screw has reached the limit of its travel, the airbag module is disarmed. You can continue to rotate the screw in this position since it doesn't tighten. Never attempt to remove the arming screw from the steering wheel. If the screw does separate from the steering wheel, the wheel must be replaced. When winding the screw out or in, always use hand tools. Never use air or electric power tools or impact tools on the screw. Doing so may damage the assembly. When arming the airbag module, wind the arming screw all the way in. Then tighten the screw to 10 to 15 inch-pounds. Over-tightening the screw will damage the airbag system. As on the Grand Cherokee, you'll need to disconnect the negative battery cable prior to airbag service. On the Cherokee, however, this is merely because you're working on electrical connections, not to prevent airbag deployment. So, unlike Grand Cherokee, you don't have to isolate the battery cable or wait 2 minutes for capacitors to discharge. As with other airbag modules, always carry the Cherokee module with its trim cover facing away from your body, and set the module down with its trim cover facing up. Whether the module is on or off the vehicle, it's important to make sure that no foreign objects enter the arming port on the back of the airbag module. If you think about what the arming screw does, you can see why. A foreign object could depress the safety shaft lever, arming the airbag module. Should this occur, moving or setting down the module suddenly could trigger the airbag firing mechanism. Although we went inside the airbag module to show you how it works, keep in mind that the airbag module is serviced as a unit. Never attempt to disassemble the airbag module. If it is defective or damaged, simply replace it. After an airbag has deployed, you'll need to take some precautions during cleanup. Besides talcum powder or cornstarch, sodium carbonate, baking soda, and very small amounts of sodium hydroxide may be present in the powder inside the vehicle. Since small amounts of sodium hydroxide may be irritating to the skin and eyes, be sure to wear safety glasses rubber gloves, and a long-sleeve shirt when cleaning the vehicle. If your skin does become irritated, run cool water over the affected area. Sodium hydroxide may also irritate the respiratory tract. If you experience irritation of the nose or throat, exit the vehicle for fresh air until the irritation ceases. If the irritation continues, contact your doctor. Next, we're going to cover some service procedures for the Cherokee airbag. Before we do, let's check your recall of safety precautions with a review question. Before performing airbag module service, always A, isolate the negative battery cable with tape, B, wait at least 2 minutes for the capacitors to discharge, or C, wind the arming screw out to its travel limit. The answer is C, wind the arming screw out to its travel limit. The other two precautions apply to electrically triggered airbag systems. In this section, we're going to cover the procedure for replacing a Cherokee airbag that has deployed. Except for the cleanup, the procedure for replacing an undeployed airbag module is the same. First, disconnect the negative battery cable. Then, working from outside the vehicle, remove the protective cap from the top of the steering wheel and wind the arming screw out. The screw is at its travel limit when rotating it counterclockwise no longer produces upward travel. Next, roll the airbag back into the trim cover and tape the cover shut. To remove the airbag module, first remove the two speed control switch mounting screws if the Cherokee is so equipped. Then pull the switches from the wheel and unplug the switch connector. Next, working from the back side of the steering wheel, remove the 4 airbag attaching nuts and remove the airbag module from the vehicle. Use a vacuum to remove any powder from inside the vehicle. Work from the outside in so that you avoid sitting in or kneeling on an uncleaned area. Be sure to vacuum the heater and AC outlets as well. In fact, it's a good idea to reconnect the battery temporarily and run the blower on low. Vacuum up any powder that comes out. After running the blower, you may need to vacuum the interior again to remove any additional powder that came out. At this point, you need to carefully inspect the steering wheel, clock spring, and steering column for damage. Never install a replacement airbag module without first inspecting components that might have been damaged by airbag deployment. Make sure the arming screw assembly is not damaged and that the screw works properly. Otherwise, it may not arm the replacement module. The mounting tabs must also be in good shape. Also, check the horn and speed control wiring and switches for any evidence of damage. This includes the speed control switches that you removed earlier. If you find that the driver was not belted when the airbag was deployed, it's even more important to do a thorough inspection. There's a good chance that the impact of the driver damaged components. At this point, you're going to need to gain access to the clock spring to inspect and possibly replace it. Replacement clock springs need to be positioned correctly in relation to the steering system, so make sure the steering wheel is centered and the front tires are in the straight ahead position. Then disconnect the horn wire and use a puller to remove the steering wheel. After noting the clock spring position, make sure it turns freely. Return the clock spring to its original position and inspect the clock spring wiring. Later in this program, we'll discuss clock spring replacement and centering. Speaking of replacement, it is possible to install a Grand Cherokee clock spring, steering wheel, or airbag module on a Cherokee, and vice versa. So make sure you have the correct replacement parts, including fasteners, for the vehicle you're working on. If you do install a Grand Cherokee module on a Cherokee, the module will not function. The same holds true for a Cherokee module on a Grand Cherokee. When installing the steering wheel, route the speed control wiring through the elliptical hole. Route the horn wire through the circular hole and reconnect it. As you install the wheel, the flats on the clock spring must fit into those on the steering wheel. At this point, make sure the wires in the steering wheel are routed correctly so they won't be pinched when you install the airbag. Also check the arming screw. It should be wound out to its travel limit. After positioning the 4 airbag module studs in the mounting holes in the steering wheel, install the mounting nuts from behind the steering wheel. Tighten the nuts to 80 to 100 inch-pounds. Now you can reconnect the speed control switch wiring and reinstall the speed control switches with the 2 mounting screws. To arm the replacement airbag, exit the vehicle and reaching in through the driver's window, turn the arming screw all the way in. The screw should be tightened to no more than 10 to 15 inch-pounds of torque once it is all the way in. Next, replace the arming screw cover. If the cover does not seat properly in the steering wheel hub, the airbag may not be armed, and you'll need to check the arming mechanism for damage. Once the cover is in place, reconnect the negative battery cable. Replacing a deployed Cherokee airbag really isn't difficult at all, and neither is our next review question, if you've been paying attention. Which of the following is one of the steps in replacing a deployed Cherokee airbag? A. Inspecting the clock spring. B. Clearing fault codes. Or C. Isolating the negative battery cable. The answer is A. Inspecting the clock spring. It may have been damaged by airbag deployment. As mentioned earlier, on Cherokee, the clock spring is not used for airbag deployment. However, it is new on Cherokee for 1995, and you'll need to know how to replace it if it is damaged, and center it if it is not positioned properly. To replace the clock spring, you'll need to gain access to it by removing components as described earlier in the airbag service section. Remember that for a replacement clock spring to be positioned correctly, the steering wheel must be centered and the front wheels must be positioned straight ahead. Once the steering wheel has been removed, to gain access to the clock spring wiring, remove the upper and lower steering column shrouds and disconnect the connector at the rear of the clock spring. Then pull the clock spring from the steering column by lifting the locating fingers. New clock springs are in a position which corresponds to a centered steering wheel and straight-ahead wheels. As a result, you can simply snap the replacement clock spring onto the steering column and reconnect the clock spring connector. Then reinstall the steering column shrouds. As we said earlier, when installing the steering wheel, make sure that the clock spring wiring is routed correctly and that the flats on the steering wheel match those on the clock spring. From this point on, you can use the procedures described earlier to install the rest of the components. In some cases, you may not be sure if the clock spring is positioned correctly with respect to the steering system. This can occur, for example, when a clock spring that is to be reinstalled is rotated when off the vehicle. It can also occur when a clock spring is rotated independently of the steering wheel and cannot be put back in its original position. When this happens, you'll need to use a centering procedure to reestablish the correct clock spring position. To center the clock spring, first, make sure the wheels are in the straight-ahead position. Then depress the clock spring's auto-locking tabs and rotate the rotor clockwise to the end of travel. Take care not to damage the clock spring by using excessive force to reach the limit of travel. Next, rotate the clock spring rotor 2 1/2 turns counterclockwise. At this point, the horn wire should be at the top and the speed control wire should be at the bottom. If not, rotate the rotor counterclockwise until the wires are oriented properly. Do not rotate it more than 1/2 turn. From this point on, you can use the procedures described previously to install components on the steering column. Now let's check your knowledge of the Cherokee clock spring with a review question. The Cherokee clock spring, A, has an automatic centering mechanism, B, is not connected to the airbag module, or C, must be replaced after airbag deployment. The answer is B. Since the Cherokee airbag is triggered mechanically, the Clockspring does not need to be connected to the airbag. That's about it for this Master Tech. No matter what your experience with airbags, you should find the Cherokee airbag system pretty easy to service. But to service the system safely, be sure to follow the precautions outlined in this program. We'll see you next month.